Welcome to Chi Alpha. We're continuing our series, Embracing Faith. Tonight, we're going to talk about the history of the church. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16 says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." A few things stand out to me from this passage. First, we need to be able to answer the questions people ask to the best of our ability. But second, having a good answer is not enough. The way we answer matters. We need to answer gently, respectfully, and with a clear conscience. That last one, clear conscience, makes me think that scrupulous honesty in our answers is essential. And so tonight, as we talk about church history, I've invited a friend of mine, Dr. Charlie Self, who has a PhD in history and an expertise in this area to help us process, because the issues here are actually quite complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of details, and I think that if we truly want to answer people's questions with a clear conscience, we'll be well served by listening to an expert. And people have a lot of questions right now. We're doing a series in Chi Alpha called Embracing Faith, where I'm sort of analyzing different objections that people have and questions people have, sometimes misconceptions people have about Christianity and the gospel. And I think there's several that are on people's minds right now. And I think I'll start with the ancient past and then move to more recent history. When I'm talking to a skeptic about Christianity, sometimes they will bring up things like the Inquisition or the Crusades as sort of a disqualifier for the faith, that if Christianity has given birth to these monstrosities, then there must be something rotten at the core. But I read other scholars, for example, Rodney Stark, who says that these are wildly misunderstood by sort of our modern lay-level understanding is completely at odds with what the scholars say. I'm talking to a scholar. What should we think about things like the Inquisition and the Crusades?
If we're thinking as Christians or people seeking to understand the Christian faith with a humble disposition, we have to deeply lament the moments that institutional Christianity displayed its intolerance, displayed its totalitarian tendencies, the marriage of institution and power. But these things you mentioned, these really flashpoints of Crusades, Inquisition, these are the exceptions rather than the rule, and they themselves are more complicated than first glance will show us.
Could you unpack that a little bit? This is, I think, tying into some of what Rodney Stark likes to say, that we think one thing, but the historical record's actually not as cut and dry as a critic of Christianity will sometimes allege.
So one of the tragedies in Christian history from the late 4th century all the way till the early 20th century is the mixture of institutional, religious, and political power. That's different than Christians exercising their gifts within political, business, social, science, and other domains. And so we have that history we have to own and understand. But let me be very specific, for example, about the Crusades. The context from the time it was first preached in 1096 to the last Crusader kingdom being kicked out in 1291, there were moments of religious fervor, but the vast majority of this moment had to do with who's going to control the Mediterranean and Middle East, who's going to control the money and the trade. And it was only as you approach the year 1100 that what we call Christian Europe even had the economies and surplus population to begin to question over 4 centuries of Islamic conquest. You combine that with the fact that Christian pilgrims were being persecuted and killed on their way to the Holy Land, you had the perfect storm of an emerging civilization, civilizations plural actually, wanting to have political and economic control along with religious fervor, and it made for 7 major moments of crusading that we cannot excuse from theological grounds, but we can understand from geopolitical ones.
All right, what about something like the Inquisition?
Well, the Inquisition actually began with the Dominican order, and their St. Dominic is also, by the way, the mentor of Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian the Catholic Church has produced. The Dominicans helped lead the way, and their goal was to literally inquire after the particular individuals or situations in which heresy was going on. In 90, well, somewhere it could be up to 90, 80% would be the low case. And 80 to 90% of the time, those inquired were found innocent. What happens over a period of time, and especially when you get to the emergence of the Kingdom of Spain and Portugal reconquering their territory from Islamic empires, you have a much harsher version of this taking over in certain spots. But overall, it was, if people were publicly contrary to the church's teaching, they were considered a social threat. Now, I don't want to go back to those days and say, well, that was benign. I'm only saying that in this context, people would not have even understood a separation of church and state. So if somebody's promulgating heresy, then that's going to be inquired about. Sadly, by the late 1400s, early 1500s, it's become an institution to begin to ban books, begin to look for heretics as opposed to respond to situations. So it kind of fed on itself a bit. It was awful in many of its moments, but in most of its moments, it was a matter of keeping social order.
And so would you say it's fair for a skeptic to put these at the feet of Christianity?
It's fair to put it at the feet of historical moments of institutional church. Absolutely. It's not fair to characterize global Christianity in the majority as responsible for these moments. Most global Christians through most of history have not had this kind of power, and the advance of Christianity as a movement, as a religious movement, has rarely come at the tip of the spear or through the barrel of a gun when you actually examine its growth.
Well, now we're sort of drifting into colonialism a little bit. One of the criticisms that I hear from students very often is the idea that Christianity is a colonial enterprise and that converts were somehow oppressed, cajoled, manipulated into betraying their culture and their ancestry and sort of embracing this foreign religion. And that missions is intrinsically a negative persecutorial sort of force. How do you respond to that as a historian?
Well, I actually teach the history of Christianity from a missiological perspective. And so I teach the various narratives of the various streams of global Christianity. And I can tell you that's not the majority story of the advance of Christianity. It is at moments a very negative syncretism in moments of the conquistadors, in moments of 19th century European imposition of political power. But in general, missionaries are despised by the colonial authorities. In general, monks, missionaries, ministers, compassion workers, whatever form it takes, they're generally looked down upon by the people that want to exercise power. And let me make this really specific. Let me use a famous person in the history of evangelical missions, William Carey. He's considered a major Protestant figure in the late 1790s, early 1800s. He was hated by the British East India Company. He was despised by the increasingly colonial powers of Great Britain. And what was fascinating about this is that he stood for the birth of an indigenous church. He stood for the people that he was serving, translating scriptures into 24 more languages. In the Belgian Congo, one of the worst moments ever of colonialism. It was the King of Belgium personal fiefdom until European parliaments forced him to give it up in favor of the government. Awful place of oppression on the rubber plantations. But it was both Catholic and Protestant missionaries that resisted that. Now, not all did. Some were tools. But recently, several anthropologists and historians of colonialism have admitted that it was Christian missions that actually undid colonialism by giving birth to human rights, by giving birth to a Christian vision that wouldn't allow this kind of oppression to continue. And most of the national movements that liberated their nations were led by people educated in Christian schools.
So that segues into this idea of human rights and Christianity. Very recently, Attorney General William Barr caused a lot of controversy by the report, right, on unalienable rights. And it's very contentious, this relationship between the idea of God-given rights and sort of like just sort of secularly emergent rights or whatever. Tom Holland recently wrote a book called Dominion, in which he argues, not a novel argument, that the very idea of human rights is rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition, particularly in Christianity. Does that wash for you as a historian? Is there evidence for that?
Well, there's good evidence from the scriptures of the dignity of the human person. You can read all through the Mosaic Law and see huge protections for the individual, especially for the vulnerable. You can read through the wisdom literature and see the combination of personal responsibility and social good, the prophets railing against immorality, injustice, and idolatry, especially as it treats the most vulnerable in society. And so you have this juxtaposition of land ownership and personal responsibility with the concept of jubilee and a reset of the social order and the importance of the common good. This translates forward into Christianity. Remember, the Christians just took all the Hebrew scriptures and then added to it the words of Jesus and the apostles, and the same dignity of the human person goes forward. Now, here's where the problem lies. Christians can't claim exclusively that they came up with the idea of human rights. We can say that in our tradition, and especially as you move into the era of the Reformation and era of evangelical Christianity, you have this emerging sense of the equality of all people. But there are also secular voices, and we call them Renaissance and Enlightened voices, some religious, some non-religious, that argued for that same dignity. But the notion of virtue-based liberty, the dignity of the individual, is deeply rooted in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. Also, the founders of the American experiment, we know many of their flaws, and we may get to some of those, but the founders looked at 30 different systems of government dating back to the Hebrew scriptures, other ancient civilizations, all the way forward to Iroquois Confederacy. And when you read our Constitution and read the debates about it and read the early documents, you find how well steeped in Judaism and Christianity these founders were.
Well, that segues pretty well into, I think, what I want to camp on today, which is the history of Christianity, slavery, racism, oppression. That right now in our culture, there are many people who look back upon the influence of Christianity, particularly evangelical Christianity, in our nation as a very pernicious negative influence, most particularly when it comes to race relations. Would you talk to us about that?
It's hard to talk about this narrative without deep lament. So let me try to paint a picture here. All through world history, in every civilization, by the way, I have taught the history of every continent on the planet. And so as you teach that history, you find out that ethnocentricity, tribalism, racism knows no particular culture. It is sadly part of the fallen world we're in. But I want to take special responsibility of the last 500 years in the West with a clear racial hierarchy. And there's just no doubt about it. And the American history, the North American, we'll just use the United States of American history, is a subset of that built-in racism, that hierarchy that was only exacerbated, we'll find out in just a minute, in the 19th century. So with that understanding, people are born into this reality of hierarchy. And unfortunately, it also divided the church. So let me give a couple other markers here, and then I'll get as specific as we can. Evangelical Christianity, put that in a lowercase e, don't put it with any particular political party, but what we're going to call a Protestant focus on personal conversion, on missions, on the importance of Scripture, and doing good to your neighbor, all of these things. It was really born in the late 1600s and early 1700s in the various denominations coming out of the Reformation, wanting to see some renewal, wanting not to be stuck in ossified, dead churches. So pietist movements, revivalistic movements are born, and they're born with mission in mind. And so places like the early Moravian movements in what is today the Czech Republic and parts of Germany disproportionate influence on missions. The early Methodist movements, several Baptist movements experienced awakening in the 18th century, in the mid-1700s. So during this moment, within these streams, there were divisions over slavery, divisions over racial hierarchy. We have to confess the reality that even a great conversion experience did not immediately liberate someone from their built-in sociology. Our friend Amos Yong says, when the Holy Spirit is poured out, a new sociology is created. The problem is maintaining it takes work. And so in 1757, John Wesley said no Methodist could own a slave. But by 1857, Southern Methodist University is present. And what happened, the tragedy of the American evangelical narrative isn't a Scopes trial over evolution or seminaries arguing about scripture. The real tragedy is between the 1820s and 1860s, every single denomination divided on race and slavery. And what that did, it's only been healed in my lifetime. It's only in my lifetime that African Americans in particular have been allowed to vote and have full access to the opportunities. And we still have miles to go, of course, in all of that area. By the way, the narrative of immigration is a different narrative than a permanent underclass. So I'm going to stay focused on the permanent underclass. Every group coming to America faced prejudice. If you weren't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you faced prejudice. But within 2 or 3 generations, your story was different, especially if you were paler, than the story of those who were in a permanent place of oppression. This tragedy of the and by the way, when the American Republic was founded, all of the founders knew that slavery was wrong. Most of them wanted to create an emancipation plan. They wanted to somehow do what Wilberforce had done in England and begin this process of getting rid of it. But there was cowardice. There was fear that the experiment would break down because of the southern states. And then after the 1790s, it became a moot point when cotton became king in the South. You cannot argue for slavery economically. It actually kept the South backward economically compared to the industrializing and agriculturally industrializing North. You can make an argument that poor whites favored slavery because they feared the labor competition. But this division of the church really continued until the 1960s. And it's only, again, in my lifetime that that's begun to be healed. So what happened is there are moments of revival and awakening in which those divisions cease to be. And there's wonderful exceptions. There's lots of Christian abolitionists, Christian suffragettes for women getting the vote. We can share all day about good movements. But in general, people acquiesced to this fallen, sinful sociology. Even if they weren't themselves overtly racist, even if they weren't themselves, in favor of Jim Crow laws, it was just sort of understood the way it was supposed to be. And by the way, we can talk about all parties being complicit in this, in the history of American politics as well. So the history is a history of Christian movement to get rid of slavery, and Christians joining with people of faith or no faith in trying to get rid of Jim Crow. That's a good history we do have, but it's also a history of sort of complicity, of omission. In my own Pentecostal circles and background, we look at places like Azusa Street as a great moment, which people of all classes and races worshiped, were renewed, went out in mission. And for about a decade, you had this new sociology that could have broken out and influenced others, and instead denominations were formed based on race, and the old sociology took over. So we've got to own that. But I would also say this, to those who want to get angry at Christians about slavery and Jim Crow, there's good means to get angry. But it's only in those places influenced by Christianity in the world where slavery was actually outlawed. Christians led the way globally to getting rid of slavery, and we still are leading the way globally in getting rid of both sex and work slavery. So you've got this bifurcated narrative going on.
Thank you. So I guess I want to explore that a little bit more, because there's a tension, right? That it's Christians or Christian cultures, Christian influenced cultures, I should say, that that come to revile slavery eventually. But you have like even great theologians complicit in slavery, which I think to many students today, especially, is like the original sin. Like that is the greatest evil that someone can do. Um, uh, does that invalidate Christianity in your mind, or does the fact that we ultimately revolt against it like vindicate us? How do you process that?
Well, I think we have to process Christianity as more than just the successes or failures of a particular institution at a particular time. And we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the foundational message and what is the transformative power of that message in any and every culture? You know, we have Christians who have been persecuted simply for being Christian. Right now, as we speak, millions around the world having to meet secretly, millions watching their churches be destroyed, watching their rights of conscience be undermined. That's more the story of Christianity around the world than the story of parts of the West where it influenced systems and politics and frankly in America, along with other religions too, given quite a bit of latitude and favor. I'll say this. What slavery does and racism does is that it points out the depth of fallenness in both institutions and persons, and it points out the fact, and this is something we talked about earlier, Glenn, it points out the fact that people compartmentalize their lives. So they experience the grace of God for personal sin, but think nothing of stepping out on Monday morning into a society steeped in injustice. Now, they might not like it. They might know there's something wrong, but they might also say, well, I'm on my way to heaven. And so that sacred secular dichotomy is really what caused a lot of people to be complicit. It wasn't that they liked slavery or approved of Jim Crow. It's that that's sort of the way the fallen world is. I know Jesus. So the privatizing of faith. And by the way, I'll tell you why that's so important. Just as I criticized Christendom and her historical institutions at times for going to war or marrying itself with power, in the American experiment, the free market of religion has been the greatest boon for every religion imaginable. But it also causes people to sometimes, it's not only separating church and state, but it's causing people to separate those domains in their life. You see, the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment and the first 16 words therein are not about not about Christians not bringing their faith to the public square, or Buddhists or Muslims, but rather about making sure the government doesn't interfere in their ability to practice their faith and bring it to the public square. And of course, we've inverted that in the last 50 years. And so it's that tension that you can have people really experience something personally, but think it doesn't apply to that secular world out there. And by the way, that's part of what I've given the rest of my life to doing, is to get rid of that disintegration.
So you're not, I assume you're not arguing for partisan churches, but you are saying that Christians need to have some sort of political theology and political engagement. Is that fair? How would you describe that?
Here's what I have come to, especially in the last 20 years. I am completely against a particular church or any kind of institution exercising coercive power joined with political forces. But I'm completely for Christians of all traditions who are gifted and skilled and capable in public discourse, in politics, in business, whatever the domain, exercising the best of their character and beliefs to influence the future of how our society may go. Os Guinness said it very well. And by the way, a really great historical marker is a little document called the Williamsburg Charter that I was a part of signing over 30 years ago. And this was a document celebrating the freedom of conscience and religion as the first freedom, and celebrating that Jew or atheist, Christian or Muslim, Buddhist or Hindu can safely exercise their deepest convictions and frankly, bring those to the public square without fear. What's happened is people have misinterpreted, they've misinterpreted both the original writings of our founders, but misinterpreted institutional power for the institution blessing those with the skills to be engaged. We need a robust public theology. We need to be speaking, for example, about race, about economic justice. And I think the church is one voice that can speak without capitulation to left or right, without capitulation to partisanship, though that doesn't mean that Christians can't join a party, but they have to remain prophetically detached at some level to be able to offer both critique and creative contribution that partisanship doesn't allow us to do.
Are there any positive contributions that Christianity has made, or are there things that we sometimes don't get credit for that we should?
Well, you've asked a question that we could spend another hour on together, but let me rapid fire here share what I'm going to describe as uniquely Christian contributions. Compassion is not uniquely Christian. Personal charity isn't uniquely Christian, but I want to bring some of the globally impactful things that we've done. First of all, care for the most vulnerable. Unlike the Greco-Roman world around her and the pagan and secular voices around her, Christians from the very beginning have cared for the unborn, the disabled, the vulnerable, the poor, the sick, and the infirm in a way no one else has. And frankly, most cultures don't. That's a foundation because of the dignity of the person. The beginning of hospitals and hospices, of compassion mission, of a social net beyond family charity lies with the early Christian communities. And in fact, Rome didn't starve in the 5th century because the church made sure she was fed as the various armies were invading. The Western Empire that had collapsed into chaos by the 6th century didn't starve because Benedictine monasteries became self-sufficient and contributed to agriculture. We can move on to education. People make much, and they should, of some of the Islamic contributions to technology and science during what we call the High Middle Ages, and some of the universities they had. But the university systems and the universities that we know today are of particular Christian founding, and those go all the way back to as early as the 3rd century, of the importance of learning and learning in community, and not just learning the Bible, but everything connected with it that was part of God's grace to us in the world. We could go on to the origins of modern science. We could talk about the origins of not only the university, but also of free enterprise and natural pricing and the market economy. Now, when it's ethical and when it works, that's how 3 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in my lifetime. It wasn't from Venezuela and Cuba. Suffrage for women. Most of those suffragettes you've seen movies about or read books about or looked in articles were church-going married women. And in fact, Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist who was fighting to end slavery, actually told some suffragettes, "We'll get to your issue later. Let's get slavery first." But he acknowledged that they had an issue. And so the vote for women, the vote for people without property was a Christian-led. By the way, you've heard about temperance movements and prohibition. And I'm certainly not advocating for a new prohibition. But those temperance movements were rooted in wanting to make sure the working classes weren't drowning in their poverty and distillation. And in fact, the Guinness Brewing Company was founded as an evangelical enterprise to offer the working class something healthy and low alcohol compared to the gin that was killing them. And I'm not here, please don't record me the wrong way as saying yay for alcohol. I'm only saying that these are people trying to change the world. Prison reform, education reform, public education. This all comes out of Christian impulses. Universal education goes back to the 17th century with Bishop Comenius, but it goes forward with Horace Mann and others. And certainly it's taken pathways that nobody expected in ways that Christians don't always agree with. But the impulse to universal rights, blessings, opportunities is uniquely Christian.
Well, that's a list indeed. Charlie, that's awesome. Thank you.
I'm just delighted to be able to share the good news, even as we have to own and lament over the bad news.
Just a few concluding questions here. First, we've covered a wide range of history. I know that some things that you've talked about, people might be interested in learning more about. And so we've talked about the Crusades, the Inquisition. We've talked about colonialism. We've talked about the history of racism in America, founding of America, all these different threads. Are there books, are there journal articles, are there particular resources you would recommend for people who want to dig deeper, especially coming from a Christian perspective?
Sure. I think a book that is easily accessible is Jonathan Hill, What Has Christianity Done for Us? And he simply details the Christian contributions to science, technology, music, art, literature, politics. Alvin Schmidt has written a similar book the same way. And so both of those authors, Alvin Schmidt and Jonathan Hill, are really accessible. By the way, they're not pretending there hasn't been this darker side or this shadow side. They're trying to offer that as something important. Madetoflourish.org, you will find voices, not so much speaking about history, but speaking about current issues with theology and history underneath it. And so I would commend our website, not because it's the final answer, but because in this moment, it's a kind and thoughtful voice. Another voice is missioalliance.org. And it tends to the more prophetic side. It tends to the more, hey, we can't sit quietly and simply allow these injustices to continue, but they are fully I'm on the board, but we're fully evangelical in the sense of gospel-centric. We're kind of avoiding the capital E cultural evangelical and saying, we're trying to take seriously the gospel and how it applies. And so you'll find some really good threads there as well. Journals are a little bit harder. I think that depending on your interest, and by the way, people are welcome to contact me at drcharlieself@yahoo.com. You also are welcome to give out my website and my cell phone to anybody who asks, and I'll be glad to put people on to even more resources. Another voice I would really commend in this moment of racial tension is Anthony Bradley of King's College in New York City. Anthony Bradley is a reformed theologian, social commentator, and he's an African-American leader who is presently arguing for transitional justice, for true repair, not sweeping history under the rug, but not simply starting one more government program, but calling the church to lead the way in the hard conversations and the real reparation, both of relationship and of justice pathways that we often avoid. So I really commend Anthony Bradley. Luke Bobo, my friend at Made to Flourish, has written a great book called Race, Apologetics, and Economics. Is there a connection? And the answer is yes, but it's a small book that he's written trying to say, let me tell you a little bit about these realities, these economic realities. On the subject of economics, I recommend your Hoover Institute friend, Thomas Sowell, to give an honest empirical perspective on what helps people flourish, and fascinating studies of the history of different people groups and the conditions under which they flourish or are oppressed. So at the Hoover Institute there, and I could keep going, but I think Luke Bobo, Anthony Bradley, Jonathan Hill, Alvin Schmidt would be voices that I think our sisters and brothers here would enjoy.
All right, very good. Final question then. So your study of history, has that deepened your faith? Has it challenged your faith? Do you find that the Christian gospel has borne the fruit throughout the ages you would expect it to have borne?
Wow, what a great question. I'm trying to figure out how to encapsulate it in a brief answer. My study of history in general and of Christian history as a subset of the larger history, there are three things that have come to me that I'm heartened by and challenged by. Number one, history confirms the biblical narrative that we are beautiful and we are broken. It confirms all four chapters of our biblical narrative that tell us that we are created in God's image, which is the source of human rights, the divine design and importance of each person. It confirms the fact that we are broken, and both personally and socially. It confirms the fact that when Jesus Christ and his gospel is received and thought about and applied to both personal and social life, we begin to see positive change. And finally, the hope of Christianity, not just pie in the sky, but the genuine hope that one day things are going to be put right, and the fact that we get to participate in seeing that begin to happen now. History has borne out all 4 chapters of that great biblical narrative. And so the more I study history, no matter how difficult it is, the more the biblical narrative shines as true, and the more that the gospel shines as the full and complete hope we need when it's applied both personally and community to the problems that we face.
That's a good place for us to stop and worship. If I had to summarize everything that Charlie said so far, I'd say something like this. If you go and study history looking only for reasons to condemn the church, you can find them. And if you were to look through history searching only for reasons to vindicate the church, you can find those instead. That's just human nature. You can always find a way to fulfill your agenda. But hearkening back to what we read from 1 Peter, if you want to tell the story with a clear conscience, if you want facts, you have to dig deeper. It's going to take some careful thought. Now, I think there's a parallel between the life of the church through the ages and your life in the here and now. Do you sin? I suspect the answer is yes. And you should not be surprised then that your ancestors in the faith did from time to time as well. But is your sin the most salient fact about your life or the best way to describe your life? No. You're growing. You're changing. And so did your forefathers in the faith. And so, of the church as a whole, I say the same thing that Paul said of you in Philippians 1:6. I'm confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. God is at work in the church, and God is at work in you and I. And for that reason, join me in praising the God who is faithful. Again, if you're able, stand to your feet, sing along out loud with us, and give God the glory that he deserves.